Self-respect. Self-respect is the feeling of having a healthy regard of oneself as a moral and ethical being. Respecting your own self implies laying down a set of scruples for yourself, setting your own strictures for proper conduct, and not going beyond a point, not lowering yourself below a certain standard of morality whatever the consequences. A self-respecting person does not allow compromise in order to get returns, material or otherwise. A healthy sense of pride, self-esteem and propriety is a signature of a person who respects his/her own being as a precious divine gift. Self-respect is the fruit of discipline. The sense of dignity grows with the ability to say no to oneself. Jose Rodrigo was a man in his early 30s. He lived in a small studio of his, in the St. Thomas Mount locality, Madras, in the 1950s. Disowned by his family for his errant ways and for being a nonconformist, he dabbled in what the church called pagan art. He lived by himself and sketched portraits for a living. Often, he could be seen sitting by the pavement railings beside Mrs. D'Souza's bakery bread and buns on a narrow, winding lane that led up to the church. He barely earned his living through his art, was largely treated as an outsider by the people who lived in the area, and had no friends to speak of. Jose had no other asset except self-respect. And one day his dignity and respect for his own self changed his life. Here's how. Street Point Thomas Mount, in those days, was a population in transition. Many Anglo-Indian families had already left for Australia and Canada. More were about to follow suit, and properties were sold and bought every day. The Goncalves family was one such new occupant of a two-storied bungalow near the church. Eric Goncalves was a rich man, having made his fortune in the timber trade in Burma, where he'd lived for the past 3 decades. He was also an art collector. It was a usual evening in the Mount. The lanes bustled with shoppers, churchgoers, youngsters humming tunes from the newly released Sound of Music, a film running to full houses at a nearby theatre, and regulars to the pub, where draught beer was sold and drunk by the barrelful. Jose Rodriguez sat at his usual perch on the railings beside bread and buns, a small easel before him, his hands clutching a set of brushes and all colors. He looked particularly haggard that day, his face thin and bony, his body emaciated beneath the threadbare jerkin and worn corduroys that he wore. Jose had not eaten for 2 entire days, and his body craved food badly. His patrons, people who had their own and their families' portraits made many times over, just to help him survive, had moved away and abroad. And Jose never accepted money in charity. He was not a beggar. He was an artist who lived off his art, and had too much pride in himself to ask somebody for a cup of tea, or a slice of toast and jam, without laboring on a portrait and earning the food. None seemed interested that day, and the gloom of dusk descended cruelly, compounding the darkness in Joe's heart. He would go hungry another day, he thought, deep in despair. Eric Goncalves watched the artist keenly from the neon-lit pub, sitting at a window, as he sipped his 6th mug of tangy beer. He had heard of the man who did portraits in return for nothing more than a meal or two. He had watched the thin, bearded man sketch a young couple's picture, using charcoal and white pastel a couple of days ago, and was impressed. He knew talent when he saw it. He was also a shrewd businessman, and knew where money was to be minted from. Jose Rodrigo was a profitable business prospect for him, and he had no intention of letting this opportunity go unavailed.
Good evening, my good young man.
Said Eric effusively, stepping up to the artist, who was already folding up his easel, ready to leave.
Well, oh, good evening, sir.
Joe mumbled back in surprise. The stranger was well dressed, he noticed.
Would you like to have your picture done, sir?
He asked hopefully, as his stomach rumbled and his knees trembled with weakness.
I most certainly would,
Said Eric with a benevolent smile.
but I suppose it is a bit too late today.
He said, glancing at the dim light that the bakery's glass display let out onto the pavement.
If you'd be kind enough to accompany me to my studio, sir. It's right over there.
The hunger pangs had returned with a vengeance.
It'll take half an hour at the most, sir.
He was pleading now, seeing the reluctance in the richly attired gentleman's eyes. Eric Goncalves sat himself on a shabby couch as the artist began to set up his easel. It was a tiny garret, with a single window looking out above the lane, and the only other article of furniture was a tiny cot that stood against the wall.
Would you care to sit in profile, sir?
Joe's directed, now the master of the proceedings.
I think you misunderstand me, my young friend.
Said Eric, studying the artist carefully.
I do not need a portrait of mine.
Oh, then perhaps of somebody of your family, sir.
Persisted Joe's.
I can come along to your house if you wish. There won't be any extra charges, you see.
No, it is not that either.
Replied Eric calmly. Joe's was nonplussed.
Why would he come to my studio for nothing?
He wondered. Eric reached inside his expensive tunic and pulled out a thick wad of currency notes.
Here, this is yours.
He held out the money to him.
But I don't understand, sir.
Joe's muttered blankly.
I am doing nothing for you.
Eric Goncalves smiled.
You shall be doing a lot for me, young friend.
He explained.
I happen to be an art collector, and I have contacts with reputed galleries in Bombay. You know, the art business here in our country is a fledgling one and the true appreciators are few and far between. There is a very profitable market in fakes of the great Renaissance masters. I'll pay you 5,000 rupees for each fake that you paint. I'll get you a new, much larger studio, all the best material to paint with.
He offered.
What's more, I'll gift you your own house in Pondicherry. It's a lovely place, and you can work in peace with no worries of where the next meal is coming from.
He said, watching him intently. Joe's Rodrigo was very angry. He had never been insulted like this before. Paint fakes. He could never in his life commit such a sacrilege. He respected art and could not for any amount of money do what this man demanded of him.
Sir, I have never before been impolite to a guest of mine.
He spoke, controlling himself with great effort.
You are a good judge of human frailty, but a poor one of human strength.
He said, looking directly into the man's eyes.
Please leave. I can do nothing for you.
He turned his back on him, ignoring the rumbles in his stomach. It was almost 11 at night and Joe tossed about restlessly on his narrow cot. Hunger had now overwhelmed him. He got up and closed the window from where the mouth-watering aroma of grilled mutton chops and marinated fish wafted in, tormenting him. He tried to concentrate his mind on his only passion in life, art, a practice he found useful in such times when he had to go hungry, and those were quite many. Steeling himself with all the resolve he had, he switched on the only light in his studio, determined to paint away this night of distress. He would set up his easel early in the morning on the pavement tomorrow. Hopefully, he'd get a customer soon and have his meal, he thought. He reached for his brushes and stopped, a frown knitting his brows together. An envelope lay on the easelage. He opened it with shaky fingers and took out a single, folded sheet of paper and a wad of money. It was a letter.
My dear young man, I had been watching you on the pavement for a few days before I approached you. I had written this note before I met you in the evening, and hoped that you would be the man I thought you to be, and hoped to leave you this envelope. I own a couple of art galleries in Bombay. I have many art experts in my employ, but I needed a person who would source art for my business with all honesty. For the market is full of fakes these days, and I found none on my payroll who would be immune to the lure of quick money. See me in my office at 10 o'clock. I'm offering you the job of the chief curator at my galleries. The money in this envelope is your first salary, paid in advance. And you were right. I am not a good judge of human strength. That is why I had to be certain.
Jose counted the money. It was 5,000 rupees,